Well, hello, free people of the Rocky Mountain region. My name is Brandon, and welcome to this Free State Colorado interview. The mission of Free State Colorado is to promote a culture of liberty, freedom of the individual, and a free market. Today, I'm joined by Kyle Anzalone. Kyle is the news editor of the Libertarian Institute, opinion editor of Antiwar.com, and co host of Conflicts of Interest, which is one of the best podcasts available for individuals who want to stay up to date on the wars and conflicts occurring around the world. Well, Kyle, I hope you are well, and thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, Brandon, very happy to be on your show. Thanks so much for inviting me.
I appreciate your time. Well, Kyle, in order to be an effective anti war leader, I think it's important to start with some of the basics of how the empire operates. So, Kyle, how many military conflicts is the United States involved in right now?
Well, under the Biden administration, it's a little bit harder to count because we had the war in Yemen going on, where the US is supporting Saudi Arabia in their war against the people of Yemen. Although they're not carrying out a whole lot of airstrikes now, they're really just supporting ground offensives in limited ways, but they're backing jihadist forces there. And then they're supporting a blockade of Yemen, preventing any goods from getting into the country, but they're also waging a drone war in Yemen against Al Qaeda. And so, how many wars does that count as? Zero, one, two? But let's just say we count Yemen as a war. The Biden administration has really tipped up the war in Somalia. They're carrying out a lot more airstrikes. They're having, ground troops carry out raids. So I think it's pretty safe to say that the U.S. is engaged in warfare in Somalia. When you look at the rest of Africa, particularly northern region, the Sahel region, this is Libya, Mali, Burkina Faso, this area. The U.S. does carry out some military activity in this region, but it's pretty limited. So I don't know if this, really traditionally gets counted as a war, but I would look at it and count it as a war that the U.S. is essentially fighting in this region. Then, of course, we have Syria, where just last month the U.S. said they carried out, I think it was 46 raids against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. So those are two more countries the U.S. is at war with. Of course, with Syria, in addition to the air war and the ground war in that country, we occupy a third of that country, the most fertile regions of Syria as far as growing crops and things like that go. The U.S. occupies it. They prevent that wheat from going to the rest of Syria, where the majority of the people live. And of course, even with the massive earthquake in that country and the thousands of people dead, the U.S. maintains sanctions on Syria that are meant to be what they call crippling sanctions. They're supposed to destroy the country, and that's why in response to the earthquake in Syria, the U.S. doesn't see it as an opportunity to reach out to the Syrian people, to the Syrian government, and try to mend ties. They actually see it as an opportunity to increase the suffering on the Syrian people because they believe that if enough Syrian children are starving to death, eventually they'll rise up and overthrow their government. Again, I already mentioned Iraq. Afghanistan is just an economic war at this point. I think there's pretty few, kind of U.S. military interventions there. The same is the case with Venezuela. The U.S. has a massive economic war there. With Iran, of course, we're carrying out the economic war, but also increasing our military presence in the region, increasing military drills with Israel directed at Iran. Then we had the war in Ukraine going on, the U.S. building up armaments for Taiwan in anticipation of war against China. We are carrying out more nuclear style drills and drills simulating nuclear strikes on North Korea with the South Koreans. And so, again, actually counting wars where we're, traditionally carrying out troop movements and airstrikes and things like that, it's probably 3, 4, 5 right now. But if you look at the proxy wars and the economic wars, we're closer to 20.
Wow. Wow. And I asked you that question because I think it's really important because most people only know what's told to them by the corporate media. And that's why your work is so important. Antiwar.com, Libertarian Institute, conflicts of interest. There's a lot more going on than the Ukraine conflict. I bet many Americans don't know that the US military still has combat soldiers in Iraq, much less all the other conflicts that you just listed. So I think it's really important to emphasize how big the empire is and how bloody the world is because of US foreign policy.
Yeah, and of course, President Joe Biden will keep blabbing about how there's no wars going on in the Middle East, even as his Pentagon puts out reports saying we carry out 23 operations a month, typically in Iraq and Syria, but last January we carried out 46.
Wow. Wow. So, speaking of Joe Biden and the administration, who would you say are the key decision makers in the US war machine? Who's deciding when to use military force?
Oh boy. So this is a tough question because a lot of it's just legacy, right? Like, once US troops are somewhere, once the US is doing something somewhere, even if the current administration has previously opposed that, to stop doing something is considered soft and therefore not allowed. So, we have, for example, the sanctions on Iran, where the Joe Biden was a part of the Obama administration that put together the Iran nuclear deal. This was a deal that put in unprecedented safeguards against the Iran nuclear program, something that no other country in the world goes through, to make sure that they weren't secretly developing a nuclear bomb. The international agency that oversees that agreement was, saying time and time again, Iran's following it, Iran's following it, Iran's following it. But Trump ran on getting out of the deal, so he did it anyways. And Biden ran on getting back in the deal, but since getting back in the deal would mean removing sanctions on Iran, the US couldn't do it. And so, to say that we're in this situation with Iran because of Biden really isn't right. But at the same time, Biden's president. And so this all falls on him. If we want to look at, more figures in the Biden administration, we have Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who I think is a little bit weak and ineffectual. And I probably put him towards the bottom of the rankings as far as who's making decisions. It also seems that William Burns, the director of the CIA, he previously worked in the State Department, was the ambassador to Russia. Famously, WikiLeaks released this memo that he wrote to then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, which said that NATO expansion was an absolute to Ukraine was an absolute red line for Russia, and this wasn't just Putin, but the entire Russian state felt this way, and so I think they're more marginal figures. People who have maybe a little bit more say, we're looking at Victoria Nuland, who I believe is an undersecretary of state. She, I think, has been very key and influential in crafting the Ukraine policy and all the armaments and support for Ukraine, and really looking to use the war in Ukraine as a proxy war to weaken Russia. And then Jade Sullivan, who's the national security advisor, Antony Blinken, who's the Secretary of State, who I think is probably one of the more influential people as far as Biden's foreign policy team goes. And you would think, well, the Secretary of State having a lot of influence means the U.S. is engaging in a lot of diplomacy. But I really don't think that's the case at all. Kamala Harris has made some foreign policy trips, say Vietnam, Latin America. From my understanding, these have all been pretty big flops. And when she went to Latin America, it was for the immigration policy. And there's this video of her telling all these people, "Do not come," which didn't resonate well with the Democratic base. And then she goes to Vietnam. They try to make a big deal out of there being like a Havana syndrome claim around the time she was there, but that really didn't gain any attention or anything either. So I guess if you're asking me, Sullivan, Newland, Blinken would be probably the three people who had the most control. Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is also somebody who has some say. But if we look at how the Ukraine policy has played out so far, a lot of the concerns of the Pentagon and Lloyd Austin have been overridden. I think when it comes to China, we have Eli Ratner in the administration as an advisor who plays and has a lot of influence, as well as the Secretary of the Navy, Carlos Del Toro, and the Secretary of the Air Force, Frank Kendall.
Wow. Yeah, well, I think it's really important to name names and talk about specific individuals because, individuals are the only people who really make decisions. So often, people can become disheartened to thinking it's this big empire, it's this big machine, and sure, a lot of it is momentum, a lot of it's based on the legacy conflicts that we've been involved in for a generation in some cases. But nonetheless, it's individuals who are making these decisions, and these individuals can potentially be replaced. They can be moved in and out of administrations as political winds change. And so I think it's really important to focus on on, hey, who are the decision makers and what can be done to either influence them or get them changed, you know? But you know, and it's also interesting, I think, for people, you know, these decisions based on big, massive decisions based on war and foreign policy are not necessarily up to our elected representatives, but these unelected bureaucrats, it seems, who are often deciding military force and military options.
Yeah, well, on that, I mean that is in big part because Congress has just allowed or given that authority to the executive branch because they don't want to be responsible for it. You know, Congress, the only thing when it comes to defense, you know, in quotes, really war, the war budget that Congress has anything ability to interact with is the National Defense Authorization Act, which is passed every year, and this funds the Pentagon, the Department of Energy. It's not the entire American defense budget, but it's a big part of it. And so this year, I think it's 800 billion something dollars like that, right? Congress does have a lot of say in what goes in there, but typically when Congress passes this bill, they take what the Pentagon gave them and they put a whole bunch of stuff back in it. Because this is where Congress can get kickbacks to their donors and things like that. And so the Pentagon says, you know, we really don't need these literal combat ships anymore. We don't need the A-10 Warthog anymore. Well, Congress says, well, those are made in my district. Those are housed in a base in my district. Those we make the tires in my district, the brakes in my district, right? All this happens. And so all these people get together and they put it back in the bill and actually increase what the Pentagon wants. They never do use it to rein in the Pentagon or anything at all. And actually typically it's almost even worse than that, Brandon, because there have been times where, say, the House will put into the bill something that says we're going to limit arms sales to Saudi Arabia because of the war in Yemen, or something similar, right? They're trying to use the War Powers Act through the NDAA. Essentially, well, they have a thing called conference committee, right? Which is, you know, we learned about this in grade school. The House passes a bill, but the Senate passes a different bill. Then the two sides get together, conference committee, they work out. Well, basically, that's just, you know, for the corrupt leaders of Congress to get together, strip out anything that they don't like. And in the case of the NDAA, it's always anything that restricts U.S. militarism whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a big pot of money and everybody wants to get their hands into it. You know, it seems it's hard, you know, and I guess that's hard too for a lot of these elected representatives, regardless of what they feel personally about some of these foreign conflicts. They have to support their donors or their manufacturing base or the special interests or powerful people in their districts. And it seems like, yeah, NDAA and a lot of these other big bills are a way for them to do that. But I
Yeah,
guess,
or
you
just
know,
support the
yeah,
consensus, right? It's not even that these you know, these particular districts or these particular congressmen would even suffer if, you know, that they opposed or, you know, agreed to shut down this particular, you know, weapons project that is built in their county or their district or whatever. But, you know, what's going to happen is if it starts to move forward, then the press is going to start to say, and all the local media will start to say, oh, our congressman is costing us jobs. And, you know, nobody actually cares about what is actually going to happen. No one wants to actually have a debate. It's just, oh, this is what the TV says. And so you know, we get stuck in this, you know, situation where nobody could challenge the prevailing narrative because, you know, doing so that every like system that, you know, makes up the establishment just smats you back down. So it just keeps going.
interesting. Yeah, this military industrial complex, right? So well institutionalized in our system, whether it's, you know, the manufacturing or the people at home, plus, you know, then the corporate news media that's often owned by, you know, some of these big contractors or at least connected to them in a lot of ways. And then, you know, it's like I don't know, it seems like there's like this whole entire class of individuals, of bureaucrats and politicians and special interests that really get their power through this military industrial complex. And really it seems that's kind of the biggest challenge to confront.
Yeah. Well, and Ray McGovern, who is a former CIA analyst, head of the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, you know, will often point out that the MIC really is too short, and he uses Mickey Mat, which is military, industrial, congressional, and then I forget all of them, academia, think tanks. He really combines, the entire establishment, the media, all together to say, this is the entire military industrial complex is really much bigger than it makes it sound. It's not just Raytheon and Boeing. It's, the Center for American Progress, West End Zets, the White House, the State Department, all the think tanks, NBC, Fox, they're all a part of this system that, makes sure the war machine keeps on churning.
Yeah, it seems insurmountable, but I do think that there is hope and there is opportunity, especially more now than ever. So how important would you say are US senators or congressmen in terms of stopping this military industrial complex?
Senators, I would say, are more important than just congressmen. They have the power to filibuster. So we've seen Rand Paul use this somewhat effectively, like the nomination of John Brennan in the CIA. So I think the Senate is a little bit more important, and also senators are. When a senator says something, it means a lot more than when a representative says something, just internationally as far as foreign affairs go. So your senator being right on things is more important than your representative being right on things. However, any representative could gain a lot of media attention. That's why Thomas Massey is so important. That's why even Ilhan Omar, who isn't always great on things, but sometimes says really important stuff, is an important figure, even though she's in the House and just one of 500 something representatives, right? Congress can always bring up a war powers resolution to try to get the president to stop any military activity. They just can't get enough support on it. We've been trying for years with the Yemen thing. I do think that when foreign policy stories are in the news, when they're things that the representative or the senator is already like kind of aware of, then maybe calling the office and talking to them is somewhat important. But I think a lot of times, the military industrial complex has a lot more say about what your senator thinks than you do.
Yeah, no, I like your point about bringing things up in the media or the public consciousness. These controversial issues, people want to have a say on them, and bringing these things to light. I think Yemen's a perfect example of that. It was largely underreported, but there was such a concerted effort that at least there was some momentum in terms of trying to stop the violence over there. So I
Right.
really think yeah, go ahead.
And I guess I could just add too that whenever you're talking about doing something with Congress, right? So if we're trying to get war powers resolution passed to end the war in Yemen, well, that is the goal. But even generating some votes in Congress for that resolution has proven to get the executive to take some steps to curb that war. So in the past, they passed war powers resolutions in the Trump administration, uh, you know, curbed some support, the mid-air refueling and things like that for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. And so we can't see things like that happen, that incremental progress be made by using Congress. But there's a lot of resistance.
Oh, definitely. And that's why I'm really dedicated to trying to help anti-war candidates. And I really hope that there's a rebirth of this anti-war movement in our modern age to kind of help get anti-war candidates elected to office and also to influence the current lawmakers and bureaucrats who are currently promoting, military conflict. So I guess in your eyes, you talked about media coverage, but what else can be done to influence these lawmakers and bureaucrats that are promoting this military conflict?
If we could get people together for protests, that anything that could drive media attention and get people to stand up and take a look at these wars. I know they're planning the rally on February 19th. So anybody who's going to be in Washington D.C., it's important to get as many bodies as possible to that event.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that's very important. So, regarding the anti-war movement, you talked about the rally and kind of what's going on there, but who are some of the most anti-war members of the Senate and House currently serving?
Oof. I guess it's hard to find an actual anti-war member of the Senate or House. Thomas Massey would have to be ranked first on that. But I will put the asterisk of just he's not a major foreign policy guy, at least not in the Ron Paul. Why he didn't replace Ron Paul on foreign policy, unfortunately. He's just that not that articulate on the issue, and that's okay. Not everybody has to be a war guy or anything like that. And anytime there's a vote, he seems to get it right, and so that's really important. Then you have probably after Massey, you would look maybe at some of the progressives, although that I would say that's changed over the past year. I would have said Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, would kind of be the two progressives. Barbara Lee out in California would be maybe no 1, 2, 3, Cory Bush, but they've all been pretty supportive of the war in Ukraine, at least after March of last year. So it's kind of hard to say, oh, they're anti-war, but they supported giving $100 billion to Ukraine. That's really problematic. Um, AOC was always much lower on that list than the other members of the squad. She's just not as good on the foreign policy issues. Rand Paul is, of course, pretty good on most things. He was bad on the Iran nuclear deal. He's been wishy-washy on NATO expansion in the last 6 months, on giving aid and funding to Ukraine. He was pretty hysterical about the China balloon. But other than that, he's okay. And then you got this group, other group of populist Republicans, Josh Hawley. You probably put Marjorie Taylor Greene, Laura Bloberg on that list, who are all very good when it comes to the war in Ukraine. They're pretty good on most of the Middle East conflict. Some of them are hot on Iran. They're all way too scared of Arabs with rifles, but at the same time they don't want a lot of US military investment in these countries. And even if it's because they see it through the Trump lens of these are like countries unworthy of American military aid, whatever it takes to get us to stop blowing these people to bits, right? Like the Democrat solution is we're going to kill the right Somalis, and Matt Gaetz' solution is we're just going to leave the Somalis alone. I definitely prefer Matt Gaetz' solution on that. But when it comes to China, these people are ridiculous. Marjorie Taylor Greene apparently dressed up like the balloon for the State of the Union address. That was a release from her office. So I think they're pretty hysterical on this issue. I'm trying to think of anybody else I could even like kind of throw in that list. I mean, if we're looking at celebrities, we got Roger Waters out there right now, who's making a big deal about this, and there are some other people in the public eye who are more or less anti-war, but they're getting harder to find, especially with the war in Ukraine. Just they took like the entire COVID emotional infrastructure, and they rolled that into Ukraine late last winter, and it just caught up so many people that otherwise I think would have been good on the issue in this emotional hysteria. And now they're still just you know supporting the Ukrainian Nazis, I guess.
Yeah, bizarre times we're in. Well, I mean, it is, and it's heartening, I guess, to see that there are some, at least some legislators, in the serving in the federal government that are at least questioning some of these wars and are willing to stand up at least a little bit. And hopefully they can be encouraged. Hopefully, that plank of their platform should be emphasized. And if, I really do believe if politicians or they want to run for office, they want to win. They all want to be the president someday if they could. So if their support is based entirely on their anti-war positions or their ability to limit conflicts, I think that can go a long way. And of course, supporting new candidates for office, people who are running in congressional districts and more importantly, as you said, Senate seats, there's elections every couple of years. So if we can get a couple of those people to be more of those anti-war types, in the Ron Paul tradition, I think we'll be a lot better off that way.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to look at the state level, one of the best politicians is Eric Brakey, and he's a real true anti-war guy. He's absolutely fantastic on the issue. I've talked about it with him before, and yeah, and he's a local level politician, state senator kind of guy, and maybe one day he'll take that state senate seat and turn it into an actual national office seat, and we'll probably have then our most anti-war representative, our senator we maybe ever had. Well,
Oh
other than
yeah,
Ron Paul.
of course, yeah. Well, so I guess my final question here then is in general and as get as specific as you'd like, but how can anti-war Americans make their voices heard? How can we build an anti-war movement?
Oh boy. I mean, there's a lot to it. And one of the hard things about building an anti-war movement in this country is it has to be a broad-based coalition. the establishment Democrats, the establishment Republicans, the independents. 95% of the American media is on board with the American military industrial complex. And so it has to be the marginal figures on the right and the left getting together and, making our voices heard that way. Alone, there's just not enough. And so, that means events with Scott Horton and Matt Blumenthal, with, Spike Cohen and Jill Stein, these kind of combinations getting together. There's a ton of other names, but those are just easy ones that came to the top of my head. Gained together, and I think that's how the anti-war movement will be built. I don't know really if the libertarians, even combining with the American right, like let's say we get them better on the China issue, better on the forum, because Tucker Carlson isn't terrible on it. We get better and better on the China issue. I still don't know if that's enough. I do think you have to look towards the very progressive principled left. You gotta look even not necessarily to Ilhan Omar, but to Matt Blumenthal, to like my friend Misty Winston. There's a bunch of great leftists in America who really put the war issue on top. And I've I as an antiwar.com guy, I know a lot of left-wing people. They don't argue with me. They don't say, Kyle, why do you want to kill me by taking away my health care, my social security? They understand I'm a libertarian. They leave those issues alone for me. And I think we have to have a little bit more of that. Just we're getting together on the anti-war issue. That doesn't mean that I endorse everything that person believes. That doesn't mean they endorse everything I believe. I think that's kind of a sickness that we have in our just general American culture right now, with this association blame game, where it's actually difficult to argue with people on positions. And whenever you have actual conversations with people, you understand their positions on a deeper level. You gain a lot of nuance into their insights. And that means that typically their position isn't as bad as you thought it was before. And so if you play this association blame game, all you have to do is link somebody through 1 or 2 degrees to somebody bad, and then you could completely dismiss them. It's like, oh, well, because so and so who did this event with so and so, well, do you support Nazis or do you reject your friend? And it's like, well, that guy's still my friend. Okay, so you love Nazis, and now I don't have to listen to you or talk to you anymore. That's a lot of the discourse in America, and we got to get away from that.
Right, the 30-second news bite where people are just trying to get a little hit on their opponent and make themselves seem a little bit superior. Yeah, well, and that's why I'm thankful for the work you're doing, as well as Scott Horton and many others. And I'm hopeful as well because with these long form podcasts, the Joe Rogan style, and this new media that's developed in America and in the world, it's really provided an opportunity for people to become more nuanced and more understanding, and hopefully gain a deeper level of knowledge than the superficial stuff we hear on the corporate media.
Yeah.
So I am hopeful. I hope you are too. I think it's more obvious than ever the war and violence will not make the world a better place. And to improve the quality of life, peace and economic freedom are necessary. And thank you very much, Kyle, for all your hard work. Wish you the best, and I'll encourage everybody to check out your content.
All right, thank you so much, Brandon. You're for having me on. You do a lot of important work yourself, so keep it up, man.
I appreciate it, Kyle. Well, take care, and thank you very much for your time.
You too.